4:47 a.m., Pottsville, New York, April 18, 2026. The south loading dock of the Allegheny wire and tube recovery plant had been sealed since 2019. The padlock on the outer gate was rated for outdoor industrial use. It took the FBI hostage rescue team 11 seconds to remove it. 31 federal agents moved through the gap in a single file. No sirens, no exterior lights. The temperature outside was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Freezing rain had been falling since midnight. The agents wore full tactical kit, plate carriers, ballistic helmets, night vision binoculars mounted at 45 degrees. Their boots cut into the ice crust covering the gravel apron of the loading dock. No one spoke above a whisper. Hand signals only passed the outer gate. Inside, 78,000 square feet of abandoned industrial space, rust-streaked machinery, chain-link partitions, overhead cranes frozen in place, and somewhere in the sealed rear stamping bay, on a mezzanine above a cold concrete floor, 5 American women who had not seen daylight in more than 90 days. This is the story of how a licensing auditor in Albany noticed something federal agents had not. How a fake nursing agency dissolved a paper trail across 3 states, and how 11 arrests across New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey followed from a number that should not have existed. The plant had been listed as tax-delinquent industrial since 2021. County records showed a single night watchman on payroll, a skeleton crew filing that kept the property technically occupied without triggering any regulatory inspection. The 4 lease signs on the perimeter fence had not been touched in 3 years. Nothing about the property suggested it was anything other than what it appeared, a defunct manufacturer slowly losing ground to property tax arrears. That appearance was the design. The rear stamping bay had been physically separated from the rest of the building by a steel fire door installed sometime in late 2024 or early 2025. The door was not on any building permit. The bay beyond it had functional ventilation drawn from the building's original HVAC stack, working plumbing tied into a commercial utility connection that had never been formally disconnected, and a hidden freight elevator override that allowed access to a mezzanine level invisible from the main floor. The county building inspector had not been inside the structure since the original closure inspection in 2019. From the outside, Allegheny wire and tube recovery looked like every other shuttered mid-century industrial site in upstate New York. From the inside, it had been quietly retrofitted into something else entirely. The question federal agents would later ask and partially answer was how long the conversion had been in progress. The answer, based on material evidence recovered during the raid, was at least 14 months. The women who would be found on that mezzanine in April 2026 had no idea any of this preparation had taken place. They had responded to job postings. The operation that brought them there had a name, Crescent Care Solutions. On paper, Crescent Care Solutions was a travel nursing placement agency. The business had an Albany post office box, a registered LLC in Delaware, and a functional website with professional photography, staff bios, and a client portal. The phone tree routed through a Romanian voice-over IP provider, but answered in English. The postings appeared on 3 legitimate nursing job boards, the same boards used by real agencies placing thousands of travel nurses across the country every year. The listings were detailed, specific. They cited real hospital systems in upstate New York as client facilities. They specified contract lengths of 13 weeks. They quoted compensation packages in the range of $82 to $96 per hour, plus housing stipends and travel reimbursement. For a working registered nurse looking at a 6-figure annualized contract, the postings were competitive, not implausible, not obviously fraudulent. What they were, specifically, was a lure. Between late November 2025 and mid-February 2026, 5 women responded to Crescent Care postings and accepted contract offers. The agency's onboarding process was thorough. Background check authorization forms, direct deposit setup, housing pre-assignment letters on what appeared to be Albany medical letterhead. Each woman received a confirmation packet. Each was given a specific arrival date and a specific address for an orientation session. None of them ever reached an assignment. The onboarding packets included a pickup arrangement, a car service, the agency explained, to handle the transition from their home state. The car service was not a car service. The addresses for orientation did not correspond to any medical facility. By the time any of the 5 women might have noticed the discrepancy, the situation had already changed. All 5 were reported missing within days of their scheduled arrival dates. The missing persons reports were filed in 4 different states. The cases were handled initially by local law enforcement in each jurisdiction. No one connected them, not at first. Before continuing to the investigation, it is worth pausing on who these 5 women were, because the charging documents and case filings reduce them to victim designations, and that reduction is itself a distortion. The youngest was 24 years old. She had graduated from a nursing program in North Carolina 18 months before her disappearance and had been working pediatric oncology. Her mother told investigators she had been excited about the contract because it would have let her pay down her student loans while gaining experience in a new region. She had texted her mother the day before her scheduled orientation to say she was packed and ready. That was the last communication anyone in her family received. The oldest was 31. She had been a travel nurse for 4 years and had completed contracts in 6 states. She knew the industry. She had vetted Crescent Care against her own checklist, looked up the Delaware LLC, confirmed the Albany P.O. box, called the phone number listed on the posting. The phone had been answered. The voice on the other end answered her questions fluently, cited specific contract terms, and provided a supervisor name that matched the staff bio on the website. She told a colleague later, in the weeks before her disappearance, that it had felt like one of the more professional agencies she had worked with. That was the point. The operation had been designed to pass the scrutiny of exactly the kind of nurse who knew what to look for. The remaining 3 women fell at different points on that spectrum, some more cautious, some less. But all 5 had done what reasonable professionals do when evaluating a new employer. All 5 had concluded it was legitimate. All 5 were wrong, and nothing about their professional judgment was at fault for that conclusion. The connection between their cases would come from an entirely different direction. The court transcripts in this case run to over 1,400 pages, but a single line in an administrative audit flag, filed by a licensing examiner named in case documents only by agency title, tells the real story of how Crescent Care was found. In late February 2026, a licensing auditor at the New York State Department of Health's Office of Professional Credentialing was conducting a routine compliance sweep of travel nursing agencies operating within the state. The sweep was not prompted by any criminal referral. It was a calendar cycle review, the kind that happens quarterly, typically surfacing minor documentation issues and the occasional lapsed CE requirement. The auditor flagged 7 nursing license numbers attached to Crescent Care Solutions filings. 7 registered nurse license numbers that Crescent Care had submitted as staff credentials, either as supervising nurses or as credential validators in their placement documentation. The kind of numbers any legitimate agency would have on file. The kind of numbers that almost never get checked against their source records. These 7 did not match. 3 of the license numbers were assigned to nurses in Florida, Illinois, and Ohio, who had let their New York reciprocity registrations lapse in 2022 or 2023. The numbers were real, but belonged to real people who had never worked for or credentialed any placement agency by that name. 2 of the license numbers belonged to nurses who had died, one in 2023, one in 2024. Their license numbers had not been formally retired in the state system, an administrative gap that Crescent Care's operators had apparently identified and exploited. The remaining 2 license numbers did not correspond to any nurse in any state database. They appeared to have been generated using a format that matched New York's licensing number schema, but referenced registration cohorts that did not exist. 7 license numbers, 0 legitimate affiliations. The auditor escalated the finding to the Office of Inspector General for the New York State Department of Health. The referral went federal within 48 hours. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, HHS-OIG, opened a joint investigation with the FBI's Albany field office on March 4, 2026. One detail that stuck with the lead case agent, according to later case documentation, was this: the fraudulent license numbers were not sloppily assembled. Whoever constructed the Crescent Care credential filings understood exactly how New York's reciprocity documentation worked. They knew which fields got verified and which did not. They knew the difference between a lapsed license and a retired one. That level of operational knowledge does not come from guessing. It comes from someone who had worked inside the system or had paid someone who had. What's most striking about this case is not the scale of the fraud, it's the patience of it. Most identity theft credential schemes are opportunistic. Grab a number, use it once, move on. Crescent Care had been building its credential library for at least 8 months before the first victim was contacted. Someone had spent that time mapping the administrative gaps in 3 states' licensing databases. That is not impulsive criminal behavior. That is a sustained, methodical investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure, in this case, served a very specific purpose. The FBI's Albany field office assigned the case to a joint task force that included agents from the Healthcare Fraud Unit and the Crimes Against Children and Adults Unit, specifically the Adult Victim Trafficking Team. Within 5 days of the federal referral, analysts had cross-referenced the Crescent Care contact addresses and phone routing against existing financial intelligence databases. The VoIP routing through the Romanian provider had been used in 2 prior federal investigations, neither of which had been fully resolved. One involved a wire fraud case out of New Jersey that had resulted in 2 arrests in 2024, but had never accounted for the full organizational structure behind the scheme. The second was a dormant ICE investigation from 2025 that had been shelved after the primary subject fled the country. The overlap was not coincidental. It was a supply chain. Crescent Care was not a standalone operation. It was a front constructed by individuals with prior experience building and abandoning fraud infrastructure, who understood how to exploit gaps in federal interagency communication, and who had used similar methods before. The nursing agency angle was new. The underlying operational pattern was not. Within 12 days of opening the investigation, the Joint Task Force had identified a probable organizational link between Crescent Care's operators and 2 subjects from the dormant New Jersey wire fraud case. One subject, identified in case documents under the designation Subject 1, was believed to be in the United States under a status the task force could not immediately verify. The other, Subject 2, had a known address in the Bronx, but surveillance initiated on March 16th found no activity at the location. 3 weeks of surveillance, no results. Here's the part that doesn't add up. The Crescent Care website was still live. The phone tree was still answering. The P.O. box in Albany had received 3 pieces of mail in the period since the investigation opened. Someone was maintaining the operation's external appearance even after 5 women had gone missing and 4 separate missing persons cases had been filed. Either the operators did not know the investigation had opened, or they knew, and they were confident enough in their infrastructure to keep running it. The task force could not determine which. That ambiguity shaped every decision made in the following 3 weeks. Obstacle. March 22nd. 14 days into active surveillance, the task force's primary financial analyst flagged an anomaly in the Crescent Care bank account records. A Delaware-registered business account at a regional bank that had processed candidate placement fees from the nursing job boards. The account had been opened in October 2025. It had received incoming transfers and made outgoing payments in a pattern consistent with a functioning staffing agency. Then, on March 19th, 15 days after the federal investigation opened, the outgoing payment pattern changed. A series of transfers moved funds from the Delaware account through 2 intermediary accounts to a final destination that the task force could not immediately identify. The funds had moved to a cryptocurrency exchange. The exchange was registered offshore. The trail went cold. The task force had a window that was closing. If the operators knew they were under investigation, they might move the women, or worse. If they did not know, continuing passive surveillance meant risking further delay while an active situation deteriorated. The task force requested emergency authorization to escalate from financial surveillance to physical surveillance on all known associated properties. The authorization was granted on March 24th. Before physical surveillance could begin in earnest, the task force needed to do something that rarely appears in public case narratives. They needed to formally connect the 5 missing persons cases across 4 states into a single federal investigation file. That process required coordination between the FBI field offices in Albany, Philadelphia, Charlotte, and Denver, the jurisdictions where the missing persons reports had originally been filed. Each local agency had to be contacted, briefed at a carefully controlled level of detail to avoid leaks, and asked to transfer their case materials to the Joint Task Force. 3 of the 4 local agencies complied without friction. The 4th, a county sheriff's office in the Midwest, had already closed one of the missing persons cases administratively, reclassifying the woman as a voluntary missing adult after 60 days with no leads. The task force had to file a formal reinstatement request. The process took 72 hours and required sign-off from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of New York. Those 72 hours were not wasted. Analysts used them to build out a complete timeline of each woman's last known movements, pulling cell tower records, financial transaction data, and vehicle traffic camera footage from the routes between each woman's last confirmed location and the fake orientation addresses listed in their Crescent Care paperwork. What they found was consistent across all 5 cases. Vehicles had picked up the women that did not match the car service description given in the onboarding documentation. The vehicles in each case were cargo vans or large SUVs. None were registered to any transportation company associated with the investigation. All had been rented using what appeared to be fraudulent identification at rental locations in 3 different states. The rental location records added 2 new subjects to the investigation. Neither had been previously identified. An analyst spent 40 hours cross-referencing property records before the Allegheny wire and tube recovery plant in Pottsville appeared on the surveillance radar. Subject 2, the individual with the dormant Bronx address, had a corporate name associated with a limited liability company that had filed a lease modification form with the Schoharie County Assessor's Office in early 2025. The LLC had no other public footprint. The lease modification referenced the Allegheny plant. The first physical surveillance pass on the Allegheny property took place on March 27th. Nothing visible from the perimeter. Chain link fence, 4 lease signs, a gravel lot, 1 vehicle, a late model cargo van, parked near the south loading dock. The van was registered to a catering supply company in Schenectady. The catering company had no connection to the Allegheny plant. No employee of that company had been recorded as visiting the property. The van moved at 11:43 p.m. that same night. It did not return. The task force placed a remote camera array on the perimeter on March 29th. The cameras were positioned at 4 points along the fence line, mounted inside decommissioned utility housings to avoid visual detection. Each unit ran on a low-draw battery with a cellular uplink that transmitted footage in compressed packets to an FBI server farm outside Albany. The resolution was sufficient to capture license plates at 30 meters under ambient light. Over the following 11 days, the cameras recorded 6 vehicle visits to the property, all after 10 p.m., all using the South Dock access. 3 different vehicles, none registered to any subject of the investigation, all registered to small businesses with no obvious connection to industrial properties or staffing agencies. The pattern was consistent with a supply operation, regular intervals, different vehicles, no patterns that would flag to casual observation. On April 9th, one of the vehicles, a black SUV registered to a landscaping company in Utica, made 2 visits in a single night. It arrived at 11:15 and departed at 11:52. It returned at 2:17 a.m. and departed again at 2:49. The second visit was 37 minutes shorter than the first. The task force's surveillance coordinator noted that the double visit was a deviation from the established pattern. It was logged as a significant anomaly. What it indicated, whether a supply delivery, a personnel rotation, or something else, could not be determined from exterior observation alone. But the deviation confirmed that activity inside the building was ongoing and responsive to some kind of internal operational schedule. There were people making decisions inside that building in real time. On April 16th, an HRT advance element conducted a covert entry assessment of the property perimeter. The assessment confirmed three things. First, the south loading dock had been recently resecured with a commercial padlock, different hardware than what county records documented. Second, the ventilation stack on the building's northwest corner was actively drawing air. The building's HVAC system was running. A vacant building does not need running HVAC. Third, and most significantly, the advance element detected what acoustic sensors characterized as consistent low-level sound from the building's interior, in a range and pattern inconsistent with HVAC operation alone. The entry assessment lasted 12 minutes. The element withdrew without detection. The task force had enough. The raid authorization was filed on April 17th. FBI HRT, the U.S. Marshals Service Capital Area Fugitive Task Force, and Homeland Security Investigations staged the operation from a command post at a logistics facility 11 miles from the target. 31 agents total, entry through the south loading dock, the only confirmed recent access point. Simultaneous exterior perimeter seal. No secondary entry point because the building's other access doors had been welded shut, a detail confirmed by the advance assessment. The 38-hour surveillance window before entry was not optional. HRT protocol for a confined victim scenario requires continuous pre-entry observation to establish a baseline of interior activity patterns. Any variation from baseline in the hour before entry can indicate that subjects inside have been alerted. The task force needed that window. The baseline held 4:47 a.m., April 18, 2026. The padlock on the south dock gate, 11 seconds. The outer door, a standard commercial roll door, manually raised. The inner fire door separating the main floor from the rear stamping bay, a hydraulic breach tool, 4 seconds. Every entry point, sequenced with less than 90 seconds between the outer gate and the inner fire door. The main floor of the Allegheny plant was empty. Dust, overhead crane rails, machinery covered in industrial tarp. The stamping presses along the east wall had not moved since the plant's closure. A coffee thermos, recent, not dusty, sat on a makeshift table near the bay's south wall. 2 folding chairs, a space heater, unplugged. One agent photographed the thermos without touching it, case evidence. Near the folding chairs, investigators also noted a logbook, spiral-bound, the kind sold at any office supply store, sitting open to a page that appeared to contain handwritten entries in 2-column format. The logbook was bagged and tagged at 5:06 a.m. It would later be cited as among the most significant physical evidence recovered from the scene. The freight elevator shaft was on the bay's north wall. The elevator car was at the mezzanine level. HRT found the manual override panel, a junction box on the shaft wall, and brought the car down. 4 agents rode it up. The rest took the stairwell access on the east side. The mezzanine above the stamping floor was approximately 3,800 square feet, originally a supervisor's observation and storage level. The space had been modified. Partition walls of plywood and 2x4 framing divided it into sections. Lighting was functional. Bare utility fixtures on extension wiring run from the building's main electrical panel. There was a water connection. The 5 women were located in the rear section of the mezzanine, a locked interior door, residential-grade deadbolt, not industrial hardware. The lead HRT agent called out in English through the door before breach. There was a response. The door was opened at 5:03 a.m. All 5 women were ambulatory. All were conscious. A federal paramedic team staged at the south dock perimeter initiated medical evaluation at 5:11 a.m. Albany Medical Center was notified at 5:14. Transport was coordinated through Schoharie County Emergency Services. All 5 were en route within 40 minutes of the door being opened. Their ages: 24, 26, 27, 29, and 31. All U.S. citizens. All registered nurses. All had been reported missing between late November 2025 and mid-February 2026, the earliest missing since approximately 100 days before the raid. What the paramedic team documented in their initial field assessments has not been fully entered into the public record, sealed as part of the victim privacy provisions of the case. What can be said is that all 5 required immediate transport, that the medical team's on-scene lead called for 2 additional ambulances beyond those originally staged, and that the Schoharie County Emergency Coordinator, who took that call later, told investigators she had not received a call like that in 22 years of dispatch work. Each woman was assigned a federal victim advocate who rode with them to Albany Medical and remained with them through the initial clinical evaluation. The advocate's notes from those first hours are part of the sealed case record. They will not be released. Each required immediate medical evaluation at Albany Medical Center. The clinical details are part of the sealed case record. In the 48 hours following the raid, FBI forensic evidence response teams processed the Allegheny mezzanine in its entirety. The examination was meticulous and slow. Every surface was photographed before it was touched. Every object was cataloged before it was moved. The partition walls, the floor, the utility wiring, the plumbing connections, all of it documented in sequence. The evidence log ran to over 300 line items before the teams had completed the first of the mezzanine's 4 partition sections. The spiral-bound logbook recovered from the folding chair table on the main floor turned out to contain what appeared to be a delivery and rotation schedule. Dates, times, and coded notations that analysts would spend the following 2 weeks decoding. Several of the dates on that schedule corresponded exactly with the vehicle visits captured by the perimeter cameras between March 29th and April 9th. The logbook was not encrypted. It was not written in code in any sophisticated sense. The notations used abbreviations that were internally consistent and took analysts approximately 40 hours to fully interpret. That the logbook had been left in plain view on an open table, rather than destroyed or concealed, suggested either confidence or carelessness. The task force's lead analyst would later say, in case documentation, that she believed it was confidence. Whoever maintained that logbook had not expected anyone to ever read it. Here's what this case tells us about the systems that were supposed to catch it earlier. 5 professional women, each licensed and credentialed in their field, each with a documented employment history, each generating a missing persons report through normal channels, and the connection between their cases was not made by any law enforcement database cross-reference. It was made by a licensing auditor doing a calendar cycle compliance sweep that had nothing to do with any of them. The system didn't find Crescent Care, an administrative accident did. That is not a criticism of the agents who worked this case. Once the referral was made, the investigation moved with speed and precision. But the question of what would have happened if that particular auditor had not flagged those 7 license numbers on that particular day, that question does not have a comfortable answer. 11 arrests followed the raid. The timing was coordinated. While HRT was moving through the south loading dock in Pottsville, separate teams from the FBI's New York and Philadelphia field offices executed arrest warrants at 6 locations across New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. The operations were simultaneous by design. A 4:45 a.m. coordinated window minimized the risk that any subject would receive word of the Pottsville entry before their own door was hit. Subject 1 was arrested at a residential address in Queens, New York. Subject 2 was arrested at a commercial property in Allentown, Pennsylvania, not the Bronx address where surveillance had been staged 3 weeks earlier. The Bronx address, investigators later determined, had been a deliberate false anchor, a known address used in prior documentation to absorb surveillance resources while the actual operational base remained elsewhere. Put yourself in the position of the lead case agent for a moment. 38 hours of pre-raid surveillance, 3 weeks of inconclusive physical surveillance before that, a financial trail that went cold at an offshore exchange, and a subject who had been smart enough to plant a false address. The raid worked because of patience, not because of a single breakthrough. Nothing in this case came easy. The remaining 9 arrests covered individuals identified as operational support roles, logistics, transportation, and the credential fraud research function. One subject, identified in charging documents as involved in the credential database research, was arrested at a residence in Newark, New Jersey. According to the indictment, this individual had previously worked in a state health department contractor role. The indictment does not specify which state. That detail was not resolved at the time charges were filed. Federal prosecutors in the Northern District of New York filed charges on April 18th, the same day as the raid. The charges: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, kidnapping in furtherance of a federal crime, wire fraud, identity theft using stolen credentials in connection with a healthcare fraud scheme, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The wire fraud and identity theft counts alone carried a maximum exposure of 20 years per count. The Crescent Care domain went dark at 9:41 a.m. on April 18th, 4 hours and 54 minutes after the South Dock Gate was breached. A registrar takedown request had been filed by FBI Cyber Division concurrent with the arrest operations. The hosting provider complied within the hour. The P.O. Box in Albany received no further mail after April 18th. The Delaware LLC, through which Crescent Care had incorporated, was placed in administrative dissolution proceedings by the Delaware Division of Corporations at the request of federal prosecutors. The dissolution proceeding is ongoing. Unpopular opinion: the sentences that will come out of this case, and they will be substantial, will be measured against the specific federal charges filed. Conspiracy, wire fraud, identity theft. The kidnapping counts carry the most weight. But there is a version of this prosecution in which the totality of what happened in that sealed stamping bay is never spoken in a courtroom, because the clinical details are part of a sealed record and the charges are structured around the fraud and conspiracy elements. What the law can demonstrate and what actually happened are not always the same perimeter. The victims know the difference. The defendants will be sentenced for what can be proved under the specific statutes charged. Whether that constitutes justice proportionate to the 100 days those 5 women spent on that mezzanine, reasonable people will disagree. Now here's something that the public case record does not resolve: the financial investigation. The offshore cryptocurrency exchange where Crescent Care's funds were transferred before the trail went cold processed transactions totaling approximately $340,000 from the Delaware account between late October 2025 and March 19, 2026. Those funds were traced to a wallet address. The wallet address was linked to a second wallet. The second wallet's transaction history showed incoming transfers from at least 2 sources that did not originate with Crescent Care's known account, which means Crescent Care was not the only revenue stream flowing into that wallet. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit filed a supplemental warrant in late April 2026 to pursue the second source transfers. As of the federal grand jury proceedings currently underway, the origin of those transfers has not been publicly disclosed. The wallet holds an unrecovered balance. The offshore exchange has not complied with the seizure request. One of the 11 arrested subjects, specifically a logistics coordinator identified in charging documents as having arranged the transportation of at least 3 of the 5 victims, retained counsel and entered proffer discussions with the U.S. Attorney's Office in early May 2026. The proffer sessions have not concluded. What that individual is providing in exchange for cooperation is not part of the public record. What investigators believe, and what the proffer's existence implies, is that the organizational structure behind Crescent Care extended beyond the 11 people arrested on April 18th. The 11 arrests represented the operational layer. The financial layer, and whatever sits above it, remains an open case. There is also the question of the night watchman. County records for the Allegheny property listed a single night security employee on payroll. the filing that had kept the property technically occupied and below the threshold for county inspection. That individual was not arrested on April 18th. Investigators could not locate them. As of the most recent case filing reviewed in preparation for this account, the identity of the listed night watchman has not been publicly confirmed, and no arrest warrant has been issued. Whether that individual was a knowing participant or an unwitting name used to complete a payroll filing is not clear. What is clear is that the payroll records listing that individual were part of the property documentation that allowed the Allegheny plant to remain below any administrative radar for more than a year while the rear stamping bay was being prepared and used. Would the audit have caught it earlier? Would a county inspection have flagged the retrofitted fire door, the unauthorized HVAC connection, the freight elevator modification? Maybe, probably, if the inspection had been thorough. But the property was tax delinquent, not in active proceeding. Tax delinquent industrial parcels in upstate New York accumulate slowly. The county's inspection backlog is not unusual. Nothing about the Allegheny plant's administrative footprint suggested urgency. That's the point. Will something like this happen again? Comment yes or no, because that question isn't rhetorical. The administrative gaps that Crescent Care's operators identified and used are not specific to New York or to nursing licensing. Any state system that maintains a credential registry with a lag between retirement notification and database update has the same vulnerability. The gap between a nurse dying and their license number being formally retired exists in multiple states. The gap between a lapsed reciprocity registration and an active flag in an interstate database exists everywhere. Crescent Care found one combination of those gaps. It was not the first operation to use credential fraud as a front mechanism, and it will not be the last. The Crescent Care website is gone. The Albany P.O. box is closed. The Delaware LLC is being dissolved. 11 people are in federal custody, facing charges that will almost certainly result in significant prison sentences. The 5 women from the mezzanine in Pottsville are alive. But the financial trail leads somewhere that has not been fully mapped. The proffer sessions are ongoing. The night watchman has not been found. The second source wallet transfers remain unattributed. And the operational knowledge that built Crescent Care, the understanding of exactly which credential fields get verified and which do not, the ability to construct a residential-style habitation inside an industrial building without triggering any inspection, the network of logistics and transportation contacts needed to move 5 people without leaving a traceable pattern. That knowledge did not disappear when the website went dark. The 11 arrests closed the operation. They did not close the question of who designed it. The south loading dock at the Allegheny wire and tube recovery plant is now sealed with federal crime scene tape. The mezzanine above the stamping floor is part of an active evidence collection process. The building will not be returned to the property tax rolls for the foreseeable future. It will remain what it became on April 18, 2026, a crime scene inside a crime scene. A building that served as both infrastructure and evidence, sitting on a tax-delinquent industrial parcel in upstate New York, with 4 lease signs on the fence that nobody touched for 3 years. The demand that created it is not addressed by any of the charges filed. The 5 women reported missing between November 2025 and February 2026 are no longer missing. Everything else in this case is still being worked.